Welcome to the deep dive, where we, dive deep. This time around, you've sent us some, let's be honest, pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah, you could say that again.
Excerpts from Hegel's The Phenomenology of Spirit. That's a Terry Pinker translation, by the way.
Not exactly light reading.
Yeah, that's what we're here for,
Yeah,
right?
right here.
To break it down, find those real nuggets, those aha moments that make you think, oh, I get it now. And with Hegel, trust me, those moments are there, buried under, well, a lot.
A lot of what
A
exactly?
lot of everything. Words, ideas, history. But don't worry, that's our job.
Yeah.
We're going to explore the development of consciousness, how we become aware of ourselves. Then there's reason, and this huge concept Hegel calls spirit. It's a journey, but will be your guides.
And what a journey it is. It's like watching consciousness grow up, figuring things out. And these excerpts, they give us a map, hitting all the major milestones along the way.
Exactly. So to start, let's get a sense of where Hegel was coming from. We're talking post-Kant, post-Fichte, big focus on freedom back then, right?
Absolutely. Kant and Fichte really emphasized the role of the mind. Like, we don't just passively receive information. We actively shape our experience. They were all about building these, elaborate systems to explain how we know what we know. And freedom, that was the foundation.
But then along comes this Romanticism movement in Jena. They weren't exactly buying into all that systematic stuff, were they?
Not entirely. The Romantics, they felt something was missing. You see, Kant, Fichte, they were big on reason, categories, building these intricate systems. But the Romantics, they were more about feeling, intuition, experiencing the world as a whole, not just breaking it down into parts. They thought those systematic guys were a bit too, how should I put it, stuck in their heads.
So less logic, more poetry, more feeling your way through reality than thinking your way through it.
Exactly. They saw the beauty in art, in music, in nature, things that defied neat categorization. And they thought these experiences offered a more direct path to understand the world, a way to grasp the whole that the system builders were missing. But it's interesting, one figure, Schelling, was a close friend of Hegel, and he was really trying to bridge this gap between the Romantics and the systematic philosophers.
Okay, so Hegel's got all this swirling around him. Now he dives right into consciousness and his starting point. Sensuous certainty. Sounds basic, right? Like, hey, I know this chair's right here, right now.
Yeah, it seems pretty straightforward. And that's precisely what Hegel wants you to think at first. He starts with what feels like the most undeniable kind of knowledge, just our immediate sensory experience of a specific thing in a specific moment. It's like, this, here, now. You're certain of it, no doubt in your mind.
Yeah, I can see it. I can touch it. I'm sure of it. Case closed.
But there's always more to it with Hegel, isn't there? He asks you to think, really think about what you're saying when you claim this absolute certainty. Because if it truly is knowledge, it has to be about something really specific, right? This unique this that can't be mistaken for any other. But then how do you express that knowledge? How do you even think about it without generalizing, without using concepts that go beyond that pure, immediate experience?
So the moment you try to pin it down, it kind of slips away.
Exactly. And those contradictions, they start popping up all over the place. Like when you say now, that moment is already gone, it's become the past. And here, well, here for you is different from here for me. Even this, if you say this pen, you're already categorizing it, making it part of the general concept of pen. It's not just a singular, unique this anymore.
So this seemingly rock-solid certainty starts to crumble a bit.
Exactly. And Hegel asks, if this most basic kind of knowledge is so full of holes, so riddled with contradictions, can we really say we truly know anything in this simple, direct way? It forces us to reconsider what it means to really know something.
My head's already spinning a little. But okay, so if sensuous certainty isn't all it's cracked up to be, where do we go from there?
Well, Hegel argues that for this immediate spirit, this initial naive way of knowing, to become genuine knowing, what he calls the element of science or pure concept, it has to go through a process, a kind of intellectual journey.
So no shortcuts to enlightenment.
Not with Hegel. He's contrasting this idea of long, hard process of knowing with this tempting notion that we can just instantly grasp the truth,
Like download all the knowledge of the universe in a flash.
Right, but that's not how it works. For Hegel, true knowledge is won through struggle, through confronting what he calls the negative. And this isn't just about ignoring or dismissing things that seem wrong or contradictory. It's about engaging with them, grappling with them, letting them challenge your understanding.
So you have to wrestle with the tough stuff to get to the good stuff.
Exactly. He says that spirit wins its truth by confronting the negative, by letting those challenges transform your understanding. And through this process, the subject, the thinking I, moves beyond these initial simplistic certainties and arrives at a more complete, more nuanced grasp of reality.
So, kind of like learning from your mistakes, you can't just sweep them under the rug. You have to understand why they happened. Now, speaking of the process of learning, Hegel has some interesting thoughts on how we learn in mathematics. He uses the example of, memorizing Euclid's theorems without really understanding the proofs. What's his issue with that?
Well, think about it. You can memorize a formula, maybe even apply it correctly, but do you really understand it? Hegel argues that without grasping the logic, the reasoning behind those theorems, you're missing something crucial. He even says that simply measuring right-angled triangles and discovering the Pythagorean theorem that way, that's not enough either.
So, just getting the right answer isn't the point. You have to know why it's the right answer.
Exactly. He says that even though the proof is essential to establishing the truth of a theorem, once you have the result, the proof kind of fades away. It becomes over and done with. And for Hegel, that's a problem. Because the essence of the thing you're studying, the right-angled triangle in this case, it was kind of lost during the process of proving the theorem. It was broken down into abstract concepts, manipulated, and then put back together again. But the process itself, it changed the content, the actual nature of what you're studying.
So, you're saying that the way we get to knowledge actually affects the knowledge itself.
That's the point Hegel is making. He calls this a genuine defectiveness of focusing only on results without understanding the coming to be, the actual process of how that knowledge is arrived at. It's like knowing the destination without understanding the journey. And this emphasis on the process, on the coming to be, is really central to how Hegel sees the scientific method and the role of philosophy in understanding the world.
Okay, so the how is just as important as the what. And that brings us to scientific method and speculative philosophy. Where do they fit into all of this?
For Hegel, the scientific method, the way we investigate things, it's not separate from the content of what we're investigating. They're intertwined. And he thinks that speculative philosophy is what clarifies this connection. He makes this important point that we shouldn't just dismiss new ideas because they seem strange or unfamiliar, or just because they don't fit with our current understanding or some gut feeling.
So no more saying, that just doesn't feel right.
Right. He's calling for what he calls rigorous exertion of the concept upon oneself. That means really wrestling with ideas, pushing yourself to understand these fundamental philosophical building blocks like being in itself, which is like the pure essence of something, being for itself, how something exists as a separate thing, and self-equality, which is like a thing being identical to itself. He sees these as the pure movements of thought, and it's through thinking them through that we make progress. And he contrasts this with what he calls materialized thinking, which is getting bogged down in the details and missing the bigger picture, and clever argumentation, which is more about sounding smart than actually getting to the truth.
So no intellectual shortcuts, no easy answers. Got it. Now back to the journey of consciousness. We started with sensuous certainty, which turned out to be less certain than we thought. Then we have perception and understanding. How do these build on that shaky foundation?
So after realizing the limitations of sensuous certainty, consciousness moves to perception. Here, instead of just focusing on the immediate singular this, it starts to grasp things as having properties, as being part of a universal category. It's like going from seeing red to seeing a red apple with a stem and a round shape.
So we start to see the connections between things, how individual qualities come together to make up an object.
Exactly. And Hegel says that the thing is made up of this interplay between universality, the general concept like apple, and particularity, the specific qualities of this particular apple. He also introduces this idea of the one as an excluding unity. That means that defining something also involves saying what it's not.
Okay, so we're getting more sophisticated in how we perceive the world, but perception can be tricky, right? What about illusions and mistakes?
Right. Perceiving consciousness realizes that it can be fooled. Things might not be what they seem. So how does it determine what's true? Hegel says the key is self-equality. If your perception of something remains consistent over time, if it holds up across different senses, then you're more likely to consider it true. Like if you see and touch a table and it consistently feels solid and stable, then you're going to believe it's a real table.
So consistency becomes the measure of truth at this stage. But we know our senses can deceive us. How do we move beyond that?
That's where understanding comes in. At this stage, consciousness goes deeper, beyond just observing properties to trying to grasp the underlying forces that govern how things behave. It's like a scientist trying to figure out gravity by watching things fall.
So we're getting into cause and effect, trying to understand the why behind the what.
Precisely. Now, appearance, the way things seem to us, is understood as a manifestation of these underlying forces, what Hegel calls a play of forces. And these forces are constantly interacting, transforming into their opposites. Think about how magnets work with attraction and repulsion. And out of this constant interplay, consciousness starts to reflect on itself, on its own capacity to understand these forces. It's starting to realize its own power as a knowing subject.
Okay, so we've gone from sensing to perceiving to understanding. What's next?
The next big leap is self-consciousness. And this is a game changer because it's not just about knowing the world, it's about knowing yourself, being aware of yourself as the one who's aware.
That's a pretty profound realization, isn't it?
It is. Hegel says that self-consciousness emerges from this vanished knowing of an other. It's like all those previous stages, the singular, the universal, the forces, they're still there, but now they're part of this self-conscious awareness. It's like you've integrated them into your understanding of yourself.
So it's not just about the world anymore. It's about me in the world, me as the subject experiencing it.
Exactly. And this self-consciousness, initially, it expresses itself in this simple statement, I am I. But Hegel argues that for self-consciousness to fully exist, it needs to encounter otherness, something that is not itself. And this leads to the concept of desire as the essential nature of self-consciousness.
So my awareness of myself actually depends on my interaction with things that are not me.
In a way, yes, because self-consciousness wants to be recognized, to have its existence confirmed by something outside itself. Now, self-consciousness has a double object, the immediate objects of the world, which it sees as something to be overcome, and itself, which it recognizes as its true essence.
Mm?
And the way this opposition is resolved is through this struggle for recognition.
And this is where we get to the famous master-slave dialectic, right?
Yeah, exactly. The struggle for recognition happens when two self-consciousnesses encounter each other. Each wants to be recognized as independent, as free. But this recognition, to be genuine, can't come from force or domination. It has to be freely given by an equal. And that's where the master-slave dynamic comes in.
So how does that play out?
Well, initially it seems like the master is the winner. They've asserted their dominance. They're recognized by the slave. But Hegel argues that this recognition is flawed because it comes from someone who is not free, who is not recognized in return. And what's more, the master becomes dependent on the slave's labor, on the slave's work in shaping the world. So the master's existence becomes kind of passive, while the slave, through their work, actually develops a deeper sense of self-consciousness.
So it's a reversal. The master becomes dependent, and the slave finds a path to freedom through work.
Precisely. And this dynamic, it makes you think about power structures in the world, doesn't it? Who really holds the power in these seemingly unequal relationships?
It definitely does. So after this struggle for recognition, where does self-consciousness go from there?
Well, Hegel explores a few other forms of self-consciousness. First, there's Stoicism, where self-consciousness tries to find its essence in pure thought, detaching itself from the external world. It's about creating this inner fortress of self-reliance.
So it's about finding freedom within, regardless of what's happening outside.
Yes, and then you have skepticism, which takes the opposite approach. It doubts everything, questions all claims to knowledge, even those coming from within. It's a state of constant questioning and uncertainty.
So Stoicism is about finding certainty. Skepticism is about embracing uncertainty.
In a way, yes. And these ultimately lead to the unhappy consciousness. This is a state of deep division where self-consciousness feels torn between an awareness of an unchanging universal being, often associated with God, and its own experience of being finite, imperfect, and constantly changing.
So it's like this gap between the ideal and the real, the divine and the human.
Exactly. And the unhappy consciousness is constantly trying to bridge that gap, but can't. One form of this is the beautiful soul, which tries to preserve its purity by withdrawing from the world, but ends up being ineffective and kind of fading away.
It sounds like a pretty bleak state to be in. How do we get out of this unhappiness?
Well, Hegel says that this struggle is necessary, that it eventually leads to reason. And reason for Hegel is the certainty that your own rational structure, the way you think, is the fundamental structure of reality itself. It's a bold claim, but it's where consciousness starts to feel at home in the world, to see its own rationality reflected in the world around it.
So reason is about finding that connection between how we think and how the world works.
Right. And the first expression of this is observing reason, where consciousness focuses on understanding the natural world, discovering the laws that govern it. This is where the scientific impulse comes from, this drive to observe, experiment, and find those underlying patterns.
So reason is about looking outward, trying to make sense of the world through observation and experimentation.
Yes, but Hegel points out that there's a tension here. Observing reason tends to focus on fixed laws, static being, but reality is constantly changing, evolving. He's critical of relying too much on analogy and probability, arguing that they can only get you so far. The real goal is to move from these observed patterns to pure concepts, like how early understandings of electricity tied to specific materials eventually gave way to the more abstract concepts of positive and negative charge.
So it's not just about collecting data, it's about understanding the underlying concepts, the deeper structure of things.
Exactly. And after observing the natural world, reason turns its attention to spirit. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because spirit for Hegel is about self-consciousness, realizing itself not just as an individual I, but as a collective we. It's the recognition that our individual identities are shaped by and intertwined with this larger social and historical context.
So it's like moving beyond the individual ego to a sense of shared identity, a collective consciousness.
Exactly. And this shared spirit, it expresses itself through customs, traditions, laws, what Hegel calls ethical substance. And at the heart of this ethical life is trust, a kind of unquestioning unity with this shared spirit. Think of a close-knit community where everyone shares the same values and beliefs.
It sounds like a pretty harmonious state, but surely there's conflict too, right? What happens when individual desires clash with these shared values?
You're right, it's not all smooth sailing. Hegel talks about the tension between pleasure and necessity, between individual desires and the demands of the social order. He explores the law of the heart, where people assert their own individual moral codes, which can lead to conflict with the laws of others. And he also talks about virtue as this attempt to reconcile these differences, to bring about the good in the world. But it's constant struggle. He also introduces this important idea of cultural formation, or Bildung, which is the ongoing development of spirit through different historical and societal stages.
So it's a dynamic process, this interplay between the individual and the collective, between personal desires and shared values.
Absolutely. And within this development of spirit, Hegel sees the Enlightenment as a crucial turning point. He describes it as pure insight turned against faith. It's the rise of reason, critical thinking, questioning authority, particularly religious authority. And it's a radical shift because it challenges this traditional worldview based on faith and replaces it with a focus on reason and what's practically useful.
So it's like a paradigm shift from faith to reason.
Exactly. And from this emphasis on reason emerges morality. And for Hegel, morality is all about duty, doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, regardless of the consequences. But he also recognizes the tension here, because in real life, actions have consequences, and sometimes doing what seems morally right can lead to negative outcomes.
So it's a complex issue, trying to reconcile abstract moral principles with the messiness of the real world.
Right. And to address this, Hegel introduces the concept of conscience. He sees conscience as this deeper level of moral awareness, an inner compass that guides our actions, giving content to these abstract notions of duty and law. It's about integrating moral principles into your very being, making them part of who you are.
So morality becomes less about following external rules and more about this inner sense of right and wrong.
Exactly. And as we approach the culmination of this journey, we briefly touch upon religion. This is where spirit starts to grasp the infinite, the ultimate ground of being, but it's still a limited understanding, often expressed through symbols and rituals.
So it's a step towards a more complete understanding of the ultimate reality.
Yes, and finally we arrive at absolute knowing. This is the end goal, the point where the separation between consciousness and its object is fully overcome. It's pure knowing that knows itself, a state of complete unity where being and essence are one. And Hegel emphasizes the role of language in reaching this state. He sees language as the medium through which we express ourselves, share our understanding with others, and ultimately arrive at this collective shared knowledge.
So it's not just about individual enlightenment, it's about this shared understanding that emerges through language and dialogue.
Precisely. It's the combination of this long and winding journey where consciousness separates itself from the world and then progressively reunites with it on a higher and higher level.
Wow, what a journey. So what's the key takeaway for you, our listener, from this deep dive into Hegel's phenomenology of spirit?
It's about understanding that consciousness is not static. It's not something we're born with fully formed. It's a dynamic process of growth and development filled with challenges, contradictions, and ultimately resolutions. We've seen how it moves from the most basic sensory awareness to the most complex forms of understanding, from the individual to the collective, from the finite to the infinite.
And hopefully we've highlighted some of those mind-blowing moments along the way, like that realization that our most basic certainty about the world is actually pretty shaky, and that our very sense of self depends on our interactions with others. It really changes how you view the world, doesn't it?
It does. And engaging with these Hegelian concepts, even at this introductory level, can give you a whole new perspective on how we know what we know, how we become who we are, and how we relate to the world around us.
Absolutely. So, our final thought for you. Think about this constant tension between your own immediate experiences and those more abstract conceptual ideas. Which of these stages of consciousness that Hegel outlines resonates most with you right now? What are you struggling with? What are you curious about? This is just the beginning, the first step on a much longer journey of philosophical exploration. Thanks for diving deep with us.